McGraw-Hill, Living with Art, 13th edition, Part 5, Chapter 16, The Renaissance. Chapter outline: the early and high Renaissance in Italy, the Renaissance in the North, the late Renaissance in Italy. The early and high Renaissance in Italy. Renaissance art reflects the reborn interest in the forms and ideas of classical antiquity among humanists. The early and high Renaissance in Italy. Renaissance artists developed techniques and strategies for representing the visual world, including linear perspective, chiaroscuro, and atmospheric perspective. Among early Renaissance artists, the finest sculptor by far was Donatello. His statue of David, an early work, embodies the characteristics of this new era in its style, theme, and context. It reflects humanist interest in ancient Greek and Roman art by celebrating the nude human, especially male, the body as God's most perfect creation. This sculpture was the first full round nude sculpture to be made since antiquity. The young David stands contrapposto, and his body is naturally proportioned. His pensive face and confident pose are expressive, and he stands over the severed head of Goliath. Donatello created the sculpture for the Medici family, wealthy bankers who placed it in their palace in Florence. The story of the underdog David defeating the more powerful Goliath was a metaphor for the stance taken by Florence against larger states such as Milan, a theme that was soon to be taken up again by Michelangelo. The Medici family sought to link themselves to Florence by commissioning this image for their home. When the family was driven from the city at the end of the 15th century, Florentine citizens took this highly symbolic sculpture and installed it in a public square. Masaccio painted this piece, the Trinity with the Virgin, St. John the Evangelist, and donors. And it appears in an architectural setting. The holy figures occupy the space under the arch leading to a coffered barrel vault. The painting's donors appear to kneel next to decorative rectangular columns called pilasters that frame the round arch and support the entablature. Masaccio painted the architecture of this fresco in the church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, using the new technique of linear perspective to construct a deep and convincing space for setting his figures. Masaccio has arranged the figures in a stable triangle that extends from the head of the God the Father who stands over the dead Christ, through the two donors to either side of the holy grouping and outside their sacred space. Triangular or pyramid organization would remain a favorite device of the Italian Renaissance artist. Earlier, we noticed it in Raphael's Madonna of the Meadows. Masaccio's composition is organized by a vanishing point perspective, located directly under the cross at the midpoint of the ledge on which the donors kneel. 5 feet above the floor, it is at eye level of an average viewer. For visitors to the church, the painting is thus designed to be as a convincing illusion as possible. The early and high Renaissance in Italy. Renaissance art promoted the interest and image of nobles and wealthy bankers and depicted Christian mythological themes, portraits, and images of daily life. The Medici Palace, where Donatello's David originally stood, is in the heart of Florence. As with the sculpture, the palace's patron, Medici, used his home to embody both the new ideas about art and his family's important role in the Florentine Republic. Although much of the building was inspired by ancient Greek and Roman architecture, the architect, Di Bartolomeo, used heavy rough-hewn stone on the lower level. This visually linked the new building to the city's medieval places, including the town hall. Double windows topped by arches on the second and third stories provided another visual link. The clear separation of floors, the round arches, and the elaborate cornice at the top of the New Medici Palace, on the other hand, were inspired by classical architecture. So too was the courtyard surrounded by columns inside the palace, which was based on the floor plan of the ancient Roman homes. This courtyard is where Donatello's sculpture of David stood to be admired by the Medici's customers and peers. In addition to Christian themes, Renaissance artists turned to stories of Greek and Roman gods and goddesses for subject matter, as did many Renaissance poets. An example is Primavera by Sandro Botticelli. Born in 1445, Botticelli belonged to the third generation of Renaissance artists. Early in his career, he had the great fortune to enjoy the patronage of the Medici, who commissioned this painting. The Medici sponsored an academy, a sort of discussion group where humanist scholars and artists met to discuss classical culture and its relationship to Christianity. The reconciliation of these two systems of thought gave rise to a philosophy known as Neo-Platoism, after the Greek philosopher Plato. Works like the Primavera hung in homes of wealthy Italian nobles, merchants, and bankers. They represented a family's power and social status within this elite community. A capstone featuring a tournament scene was created to commemorate a marriage between two of these families. Their coat of arms carved into its gilded wood, cassoni were the bedchamber chest for sorting housewares. Families commissioned them as gifts for the bride to take to her new home. This example by an anonymous Florentine artist pictures a tournament like the ones that were held to celebrate weddings. The painting shows men from both families engaging in acts of bravery before onlookers and the backdrop of the city. The chest bearing the painted panel employs the classical architectural elements we saw in the San Andrea, including the pilasters and the entablature. This painting, known as the Venus of Urbino by Titanian, is a sensuous expression of Venetian taste. The viewer can almost feel the texture of the bed sheet, the fabric wall covering, the dog's fur, and the woman's hair and skin. The colors are rich and saturated, with passages of red repeated across the canvas, bed, flowers, and dress. Titanian's command of linear perspective is demonstrated by the convincing illusionistic space that the figures occupied. Along the green backdrop keeps our eyes in the foreground. There the woman's gaze meets ours as she coyly lowers her head and displays her body for our viewing. Such sensuality caused paintings like this to spend most of their time covered, only to be revealed for a select audience. The early and high Renaissance in Italy. Renaissance architecture uses the language of ancient Greek and Roman architecture. Here is an example of the ways in which Renaissance architecture uses the language of ancient Greek and Roman architecture. Mexico's painted architectural setting has a real-life equivalent in the Church of St. Andrea by the architect Leon Battista Alberti. The photograph seen here is taken looking up the nave towards the apse. The light in the middle distance is entering through the dome that rises over the crossing. Tall pilasters line the nave with an entablature and a coffered barrel vault above. The interior is structured around the geometric shapes of the circle and the square. The aisles of the standard basilica plan have given way to a progression of square barrel-vaulted chapels along the majestic barrel-vaulted nave. The space of the crossing where the transept and the nave meet makes a square. Above is the circular base of the dome. The vast interior space, composed of geometric volumes, harks back to the Roman examples such as the Pantheon. Renaissance humanists believed that the circle and the square were perfect shapes that reflected God's singular perfection. This belief was shared by Leonardo da Vinci, who tried to make his perfectly proportioned man fit within both the square and the circle. The early and high Renaissance in Italy. Renaissance artists consider the circle and the square perfect and holy. Leonardo da Vinci is the artist who most embodies the term Renaissance man. Many people consider him to have been the greatest genius who ever lived. He was possessed of a brilliant and inquiring mind that accepted no limits. Throughout his long life, he remained absorbed by the problem of how things work and how they might work. A typical example of his investigations is the well-known Study of Human Proportions, in which the artist sought to establish ideal proportions for the human body by relating it to the square and the circle. Above and below the figure is Leonardo's eccentric backwards writing, which he used in notes and journals. The original architect of this building was a man named Bramante, and the construction of this church had already begun when Michelangelo came to it. Michelangelo revised Bramante's plan, gathering its elaborate fussiness into a bold, harmonious design. Central and cross plans merged in a new idea that relates the powerfully symbolic cross to the geometric forms that Renaissance artists loved, the square and the circle. The hemisphere dome floats atop a center on a tall drum. As built, however, the dome is taller and has an ovoid shape. The engraving seen here suggests the building that Michelangelo conceived, an organic whole with pulsating contours and a powerful upward thrust. It is the architectural equivalent of his muscular nudes. Changes made in the 17th century, however, altered the design, lengthening the nave and adding a new facade, and placing massive arms around the square in front to welcome in pilgrims. The early and high Renaissance in Italy. Leonardo da Vinci embodies the well-rounded Renaissance person. The term Renaissance man is applied to someone who is very well informed about or very good at doing many different, often quite unrelated things. It originated in the fact that several of the leading figures of the Renaissance were artistic jack-of-all-trades. Michelangelo was a painter, sculptor, poet, and architect, and gifted at all of these. Leonardo da Vinci was a painter, an inventor, a sculptor, an architect, an engineer, a scientist, a musician, and an all-around, well-rounded intellectual. Leonardo's interest in mathematics is also evident from his careful rendering of the perspective. In Chapter 4, we examined his masterpiece, The Last Supper, which uses one-point linear perspective to organize many figures in the composition and set them into deep space. An experimental painting technique served the artist less well. Rather than employing the established fresco method, Leonardo worked in a medium that he devised for the Last Supper project, thus dooming his work to centuries of restoration. Early and high Renaissance in Italy, Michelangelo perfected the representation of the painted and sculpted human body according to Renaissance ideals. Leonardo's rival in greatness was Michelangelo, who began his career in Florence but also worked in Rome. Michelangelo had established his reputation as a sculptor by the age of 25. A year later, he received the commission for a colossal image of the biblical hero David, the subject taken up a half a century earlier by Donatello. The David statue reveals Michelangelo's debt to classical sculpture. David is not, however, a simple restatement of Greek art. The Greeks knew how bodies looked on the outside. Michelangelo knew how they looked on the inside as well, and how they worked, because he had studied human anatomy and had dissected corpses. He incorporated this knowledge into a figure that seems to be made of muscle, flesh, and bone, all in marble. Not long after completing the David, Michelangelo embarked on the masterpiece that has become his best-known work, the ceiling frescoes of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican in Rome. He had been called to Rome by Pope Julius II, who wanted the artist to design his tomb, a large monument with numerous sculptures. Michelangelo set to work, but a year later Julius abandoned that project and proposed instead to use the artist's skill as a painter. Michelangelo, whose distaste for painting is well documented, resisted the plan, but in the end he was forced to capitulate. The Sistine Chapel, named after an earlier pope called Sixtus, has high vaulted ceilings, 128 feet long and 44 feet wide. Under Sixtus, it had been decorated with a fresco of gold stars on a deep blue ground. Along the sides were painted niches set with standing figures representing Jesus Christ, Saints Peter and Paul, and 30 popes who had been canonized as saints. Julius wanted all this replaced with a new fresco. Michelangelo signed the contract in 1508 and began work immediately, making detailed drawings, ordering pigments, overseeing the design and construction of the scaffolding, and assembling a team of a dozen or so assistants. The assistants would procure supplies, grind colors, prepare the plaster for the surface, and prepare the transfer to the cartoons, and paint the repetitive or decorative elements, leaving Michelangelo free to paint everything else. Day after day, for the next 4 years, Michelangelo and his assistants worked side by side on the scaffolding, painting the ceiling just overhead. To tame the vast expanse of the ceiling vault, Michelangelo invented an illusionistic architecture. Painted to look like stone, its lintels, cornices, pedestals, and supporting sculptural figures create a large grid that divides the surface into discrete zones. In the niches thus created along the sides, Michelangelo portrayed the Old Testament prophets and ancient Greek sibyls, women gifted with prophecy. All were believed to have predicted the coming of Jesus Christ. Along the central spine of the ceiling, the painted architecture frames a series of 9 pictorial spaces. Here Michelangelo depicted scenes from Genesis, from the creation of the world through the story of Noah and the flood. The detail of the ceiling illustrates here shows from the bottom to the top, God creating the sun and the moon, God separating the waters from the dry land, and the creation of Adam, with the dynamic figure of God about to pass the spark of life to the languid first man, and God creating Eve as Adam slumbers. The Genesis scenes alternate rhythmically in size across the ceiling, large, small, creating the effect of a pulse or a heartbeat. The small scenes are framed by 4 nude youth holding garlands and ribbons that support the bronze shield, painted as though decorated with reliefs illustrating still more biblical scenes. The youths are known by the Italian name for them, Ingudi, and their meaning is much debated. They may be some kind of perfected beings, or perhaps even angels. The Renaissance in the North. Northern Renaissance art is known for its interest in description of the details of the visible world, including surfaces and materials. Renaissance in the North. Northern Renaissance artists embraced oil paint, employed symbolism, and did not create space based on linear perspective. The Limburg's manuscript marks a high point in a medieval tradition dating back hundreds of years. Within a few decades, however, the printing press would be invented, and the practice of copying and illustrating books by hand would gradually die out. In the meantime, an increasing number of northern artists were turning to paint on panel, with the newly developed medium of oil paint. The Renaissance in the North. Northern Renaissance art included religious images, portraits, and scenes of everyday life, or a combination of these subjects. The Renaissance in the North. In the northern countries of Western Europe, Switzerland, Germany, northern France, and the Netherlands, the Renaissance did not happen with the sudden drama that it did in Italy, nor were its concerns quite the same. Northern artists did not live among the ruins of Rome, nor did they share the Italian sense of a personal link to the creators of the classical past. Instead, the Northern Renaissance style evolved gradually out of the late Middle Ages, as artists became increasingly entranced with the myriad details of the visible world and better at capturing them. We can see this fondness for detail in one of the most famous works of the late Middle Ages, the illuminated prayer book known as the Very Rich Hours. The book was created at the beginning of the 15th century by 3 artist brothers, the Limburgs, for the Duke of Berry, brother of the King of France. Meant for daily religious devotion, the Book of Very Rich Hours contains a calendar with each month's painting featuring a typical seasonal activity of either the peasantry or the nobility. Our illustration shows the February page. At the top in the lunette, the half-moon shape, the chariot of the sun is shown making its progress through the months and the signs of the zodiac. Below, the Limburgs depict their notions of the lower class life in the year's coolest month. This view of everyday life focuses on a small peasant hut with its occupants clustered around the fire, their garments pulled back to get maximum benefit from the warmth. With a touch of artistic license, the Limburgs have removed the front wall of the hut so that we can look in. Outside the cozy hut, we see what may be the earliest snow-covered landscape in Western art. Sheep cluster in their enclosure, and a peasant rushes across the barnyard, pulling his cloak about his face to keep in the warmth of his breath. From there, the movement progresses diagonally up the slope to a man chopping firewood, another urging a donkey uphill, and finally the church at the top. To appreciate the wealth of detail, we should bear in mind that this is a miniature, barely 9 inches high. The unication setting is replete with symbols, most of them referring to Mary's purity. The lilies on the table, the just extinguished candle, the white linen, among others. At the upper left, between 2 round windows, a tiny figure of a child carrying a cross flies down a light ray towards Mary's ear, signifying that the infant Jesus will enter Mary's womb through God's will. The wing of the altarpiece shows Mary's husband Joseph at work in his carpenter shop. By tradition, Joseph is making a mousetrap, symbolic of the devil being trapped by the soon-to-come Jesus, bringing good to banish evil. In the left wing, the 2 figures kneel to witness the holy scene. The pair of kneeling figures witnessing the unication from the garden are the painter's donors. They exist outside the space of the sacred event, real people painted in exquisitely rendered detail. This portrait, painted by Roger van der Weyden, illustrates the Northern European artist's use of oil paint to render fine details. The unnamed woman clasps her hands in prayer and looks modestly towards the ground. Her rich garments and sheer headdress, fashionable hairstyle, and plucked eyebrows identify her as a lady of the court of Burgundy in northeastern France. Roger's treatment of the headdress is particularly deft. Some subtle changes in value conceivingly show that this cloth has been unfolded and pinned to the woman's hair. The stiff fabric yet to fully unfold. The gently molded flesh contrasts the red belt with its gold buckle, drawing our attention to the clasped fingers intertwined like the buckle's interlacing patterns. Matthias Grunewald, a German artist active in the early 16th century, painted the crucifixion of Jesus Christ as the center of his great masterpiece. Originally, the altarpiece resided in the chapel of a hospital devoted to the treatment of illnesses afflicting the skin. This setting helps to explain the appearance of Christ's body on the cross, pockmarked, bleeding from numberless wounds, and tortured beyond endurance. The patients in the hospital could identify with Christ's suffering and thus increase their faith. The Renaissance in the North. Albrecht Dürer and Hans Holbein integrated Italian Renaissance interest in bodies and the space with the Northern interest in surface description. Dürer's engraving of Adam and Eve marries Northern and Italian Renaissance ideas. Like his Northern peers and his predecessors, Dürer described the surface texture of each element in this print with excruciating detail. The image is also filled from edge to edge and foreground to far distance. Nothing is left out, and many of the animals and plants carry important symbolic meanings. The Italian influence appears in the monumental nudes that fill the center of the picture plane. Both figures are based on classical sculptures that the artist saw while traveling in Italy. Dürer also embraced the Italian notion of the artist as intellect and started signing his prints in Latin. An artist who matured in the climate of thought that Dürer had created was the German painter Hans Holbein, who recognized the need to grapple with the issues that Dürer had introduced. He mastered perspective and studied Italian painting. Under their influence, his modeling softened and his compositions grew more monumental. He did not lose the great northern gift for detail, however, as can be seen in this work entitled The Ambassadors. The Renaissance in the North. Protestant reforms led to the production of a more secular art, including landscape. In this work entitled The Harvesters, in the foreground, a group of harvesters have paused for their midday meal in the shade of a slender tree. The group sits chatting and eating. One man has loosened up his breeches and is stretched out for a nap. In the middle ground, the still unmowed portion of the field stretches out like a golden carpet. Some people are still at work, with men mowing with their sheaves and women stooping to gather the wheat. Beyond the vast panorama, a peaceful, domesticated landscape stretching as far as the eye can see. Landscape which served the Limburg brothers as the backdrop has become the principal theme here, a grand setting, painted in perspective, in which the rhythm of the people's works and lives fall in with the rhythm of the seasons and of creation. The late Renaissance in Italy. Mannerist art is characterized by cramped space, artificial bodies, exaggerated emotion, and ambiguous meaning. Agnolo Bronzino's allegory illustrates some of the fascinating and unsettling characteristics of mannerism. In allegory, all the figures and objects stand for ideas or concepts that we should be able to decode or learn a moral lesson from, but the allegory here is so obscure that scholars have yet to reconstruct it definitively. This fondness for elaborate or obscure subject matter is typical of Mannerist artists and the highly cultivated audience that they painted for. Also typical is the forbidden or the erotic undercurrent. Venus and Cupid are in the foreground. They are mother and son, but their interaction hints at a different sort of relationship, and both are arranged in an erotic appraisal as well. The elongated figures and twisting S-shaped poses are part of the Mannerist repertoire, as is the illogical picture space, a shallow compressed zone filled with an impossible number of bodies. Bronzino's painting is an extreme example of the highly artificial and self-conscious aspects of Mannerist art. But Mannerist elements can also be seen in less fantastical works, such as this self-portrait at the easel. The first woman artist known to have achieved celebrity among her contemporaries, Angelusa was born about 1535 in Cremona, Italy, the eldest of 6 sisters and 1 brother. She was well educated and trained in painting. The Last Supper by Venetian painter Tintoretto is an example of art encouraged by the Counter-Reformation. A great painter of the generation of Titian, Tintoretto developed his style from the virtuistic brushwork and dramatic lighting effects of Tintin's late works. Here, Tintoretto chose to portray the central theological moment of the Last Supper, when Christ breaks bread and gives it to his disciples to eat, the basis for Christian sacrament and communion. The dramatic dialogue of the table sweeps our eyes into the picture towards the figure of Christ, who stands near the very center of the canvas. His potentially obscure position in the distance is compensated for by the light that radiates from his head. Lesser glows of saintliness and shine from the heads of his apostles, who sense the importance of the moment. Only Judas, who will betray Christ, falls to emit the light of understanding. He is seated close to Jesus, but alone on the opposite side of the table, a symbolic placement that is both obvious and effective, witnessed from heaven, crowned into the scene from above, unnoticed by the servants who go about their business. The late Renaissance in Italy. Women artists gained fame and recognition during the late Renaissance. Angelusa pictured herself as an artist in the act of painting. She had a paintbrush in her right hand, which she keeps steady by resting it on the maul stick. The painting she works on displays mannerist characteristics. The figures have elongated bodies, and there is an obscure meaning. In this Mary kissing a young Jesus Christ, Andalusa looks out at the picture at the viewer who witnesses her making this painting. Her gaze is direct and uncompromising. The painting makes an empathetic assertion of her identity as an artist, participating in the trends of her era. And this concludes Chapter 16.